Special Counsel Jack Smith. He is probing the night that Trump aides and some outside allies tried to hatch a military coup plot. Again, if those words sound a little disturbing to think about your own American government and not something happening over in some other region, well, buckle up, because your government is now investigating this with an eye on indicting potentially the people who wanted to abuse your military to take away your vote. This is a big story. I know it's summer, I know it's Friday, but this is a big story. Now, we're talking about the night of December 18th in the Oval Office, where some of the most extreme Trump plotters were working on tactics that allegedly even Rudy Giuliani warned would land them all in prison. They wanted to have soldiers seize election machines. They wanted to install one of Trump's political legal operatives to try to dictate unlawful orders, both pertaining to the Justice Department and the military. That would be Sidney Powell. She had been on the campaign side, more or less, meaning arguing in court or making motions or making arguments about trying to overturn the results of the election. And the idea was, well, wait, why don't we just put her in the government, make her in charge of the military, or dictate to the military to do things? And you don't need to be a lawyer to know if that sounds fishy. It is, and whether it's legal or not is what Jack Smith is probing. Now, all of this was documented. Several witnesses have been asked about that very meeting in multiple settings. Prosecutors looking at Powell, who I just mentioned, looking at Flynn, who was, of course, charged in the Mueller probe, and looking at businessman Patrick Byrne. Now, this is one of those times where you may say, well, I've been waiting for another Trump indictment, Ari, or wait, who are these people? They don't sound important. But remember, there's no conspiracy by yourself. And there's certainly no coup, let alone a military coup, by yourself. So whatever happens with Donald Trump, who's legally presumed innocent in the other case that Special Counsel Smith is prosecuting, I tell you right now, on our journalistic word, it is a big deal whether people who tried these things get away with them, and it's a big deal whether the people who tried these things, with or without Donald Trump getting indicted, pay their cost. Because no one yet has been indicted under the coup probe, the coup section of Jack Smith's two different investigations. And there's a trend line here that Nicole Wallace and several print journalists have been noting, that we also reported about it here on The Beat, that what was once cast as this single-day riot, quote unquote, well, was clearly something more. The evidence showed that. Now, we've documented this for you, and I want to bring it back tonight, because you look at the start here where you had the lawsuits and the electors. Those are lawful things that you're allowed to do to question an election. They don't usually change the outcome, but you can line up electors in case that a state changes the outcome. You can file suits. But then they started cooking the plots to outright steal the race, to commit fraud. Those electors were still being bandied about on January 6th with fraudulent paperwork in states that Biden won. And then you have the red arrows of the clearly illegal or unconstitutional attempts to steal the election. And you'll see there the military seizes voting machines. That's the second to last one. We've shown it to you before. The news tonight is this, which we've documented before, is now under Jack Smith's investigation. Now, as for the December 18th meeting, there was a written order that they were going to circulate purporting to tell the Secretary of Defense to seize the voting machines and related records. And that executive I mentioned was pushing Trump to sign it, according to this report, making the argument that, you know, there are times we have to be creative and take different steps. By the way, this is something certain people are good at. You might hear this in business. They don't want to talk about something bad, so they call it being creative. They don't want to really admit what they're advocating, so they just say vaguely steps. Well, that guy, that executive, former Overstock CEO who had enough juice to sneak into the White House, whatever that means, is not just talking about creativity like, let's change the marketing slogan or let's outsource some of the jobs. He's talking about being creative and getting the military to take away your right to vote. As for the effort to install Sidney Powell, well, the White House counsel at the time had pushed back.
I don't think Sidney Powell would say that I thought it was a good idea to appoint her special counsel. I was vehemently opposed. I didn't think she should have been appointed to anything. I think she may have been of the view that she had been appointed and was seeking to, you know, get that done, and that she should be appointed.
Yeah, she shouldn't be. Now, depending on how you read that day, there is some documentation that she was temporarily or momentarily referred to under this controversial post. But there is not, for example, a signed executive order or meetings with the military. And we know enough about our system of government. We talk about what failed or what doesn't work. We actually know that the military does not respond to unlawful orders, that it does not just jump and say, yes, sir, when there are requests to do things on domestic footing. There's posse comitatus and other rules about that. There's also, of course, just the general written history in the recent era. We had generals who were meeting with members of Congress and documenting the fact that they were on guard for exactly this kind of Trump crap in his waning days of power, because there was already a president-elect, because some parts of the system held. But here's the other thing you have to keep in mind with Jack Smith probing this. They didn't do the military coup. It was attempted, or it was in law, they call that sometimes inchoate, or an incompleted crime. But as you may know, attempted murder is a big deal, and attempted coups are a big deal, or at least they're supposed to be. And then you look at this holistically, as I've said, and I want to bring back that reporting we've done, because when you look at these arrows, in the bottom, I want to point to you where it says military seized voting machines. That's what I'm telling you that Smith has been now specifically investigating. There were all these other plots. Some of them lasted longer. Indeed, as you can see, the military plot was so extreme that it lasted shorter, and it ended that night, December 18th. But let me draw your attention to something I told you, if you watched this show, months ago when we made this original documentation. The actual plan to sabotage January 6th, to make January 6th a day where people would come to Washington, which had never been before. It's not like an inauguration day. When did that plan begin? Well, you can see that arrow begins exactly where the military seized voting machines arrow ends. And that is a historical fact that we've drawn your attention to with this reporting, because it was literally that night. It wasn't like a couple days later. It wasn't even the next day. That same night when this meeting broke up, and Trump, of course, eyeing his own self-interest and his own warnings from Giuliani, shifted from that aborted military plot, and look what he sent out. It's now an infamous tweet, although people might forget exactly what it grew out of. Note the time, December 19th, 1:42 a.m. Just within 2 hours of course, midnight and the ending, the breakup of that other meeting. And it name-checks someone you may have heard of, who was not as famous at the time. Peter Navarro. Report alleging election fraud. Could swing victory to Trump. A great report by Peter. Statistically impossible to have lost the 2020 election. And then there you go. This was the first time this was ever publicly noted. Big protest in D.C. on Jan 6. Be there. Will be wild. That is incriminating. And you take this all together tonight, and you know Jack Smith is probing it. Yes, I told you about this last year. Yes, we specifically drew the arrows for a reason. It is incriminating. If you had one thing that was so over the line, Giuliani tells you you'll go to prison, and when you abort that, within the same couple hours, you go into the next plot, which, of course, turned into another criminal insurrection. This is the kind of rich data that, well, builds a case, a federal case. And Mr. Navarro, who we've interviewed about all of this and who has been indicted, he's legally presumed innocent, but has been indicted for ducking the January 6th committee, he went out on TV just 2 days after that first tweet and talked about these plots, as well as, I guess in a kind of coup backwash, what they'd recently met about, seizing voting machines.
I think we need a special counsel that we put in place before Inauguration Day to get to the bottom of this. I think we need to seize a lot of those voting machines.
That was then, while they were still fighting. We had him on the beat, as mentioned. Here's what he said.
Report I did, the 3-volume Navarro report on peternavarro.com, by the way, voting machines were like a footnote to a footnote. There was just so many other things going on. I've never been a machine guy.
Never been a machine guy. Of course, I just showed you not only his involvement in the tweet that Trump sent, he was on the then outgoing president's mind, but also at the meetings where they were talking about it. Indeed, even when you go to the so-called Navarro report, he mentions voting machines 13 times. This was December 2020. There's even a subsection about them. We are here with the receipts. When we report them, well, the world can absorb the information. If Jack Smith turns this into criminal evidence, that's a whole nother level. Now, because Mr. Navarro figures into this, because he was the only person Donald Trump actually named in that first announcement of the January 6th gathering, which accrued into an insurrection, I want to also show you when we probed him on the false claim that they could swing the victory to Trump under the shifting of votes that they would call kind of a reconciliation of their fraud claims, which were lies. He actually discussed in detail how they wanted to alter and steal the election.
We had over 100 congressmen and senators on Capitol Hill ready to implement the sweep.
Do you realize you are describing a coup?
No.
That is some of what we heard in the public realm. And again, as a matter of accuracy, it is a public fact that the January 6th committee used that interview, cited it as evidence when they held him in contempt. And the DOJ did, as a matter of public record, process that and ultimately indict him. He was arrested, you may recall, and he awaits trial. He is presumed innocent in that trial. So now these events have been under scrutiny. Rudy Giuliani, within the last few weeks, was doing interviews. You'd think if they were asking about coups, they might ask about this. That was the kind of voluntary interview where he was incentivized to share everything. And if he didn't lie, he wouldn't get in trouble for whatever he shared. There is a lot building up here. This may sound like a familiar story. You may remember strands of it. I could tell you that when you take it all together, what you see is something that has gotten worse.